Okay, so I've been a fan of what you would call hard rock or heavy metal since I was about 3 or 4, and my mom played One by Metallica. Yes, she really liked that song. She was the dopest person. R.I.P. Nancy. Anyways, the presence of that song in my early life really opened the door for similar songs at the time. Also, disclaimer, I'm going to be conflating hard rock, hardcore, and heavy metal, as they all have similar connected roots. And being that I lived through somewhat of a metal renaissance, if you ask others, they'd consider it metal's devolution. But regardless, it served as a core part of my early music taste. Mainly the angst, its post-90s use of certain hip-hop aesthetics, and the plethora of memorable releases throughout the 2000s kept it in heavy rotation for me, as well as influenced me creatively. And like most artistic movements, it's currently experiencing a resurgence in popularity, for a few reasons. One of them being platforms like TikTok, where music both old and new are discovered, in tandem with the platforms that are making streaming music more accessible. And let's not forget that the sign a band model kind of died, mostly because labels save a lot more money signing a solo artist. One, because it's less people to wrangle, less money to spend, and for the most part, they only give loans to established acts that they can exploit. And it's harder to do that when there are multiple people who care about each other and are used to doing business with each other. Anyways, these new fans are now engaging with an aging fandom that seems to be antagonistic to them, for reasons other than them not having show etiquette. But why? Before we get into the why, let's kind of better understand Before we get into the why, let's further explore the context in which this music exists in.
2, 3.
You can trace the ominous and darker vibes of heavy metal or heavy music from the proto-shock rock stylings of Screamin Jay Hawkins, with his darker take on the blues ballad, as well as his haunting voice. His 1956 song, I Put a Spell on You, became a cult classic. Hawkins played up the performance by using a collection of morbid props and a strange, bewitched affectation to conjure a horrific image. This act pioneered what we would call shock rock and linked horror imagery to heavier music. The 60s brought heavier blues-inspired bands like Blue Cheer, and most notably the guitar god Jimi Hendrix, one of the greatest, who was kicked out of the army not only for playing too much guitar, but also jerking it too much. His onstage antics, going into a trance-like state on stage, playing loud, and setting his guitar on fire, horrified white folks across the US, who were already in a state of fear due to the civil rights movement, as well as anti-war and anti-establishment brought on by the hippie movement, which grew more scary for them when they were linking up with groups like the Black Panthers. Anyway, the efforts of these blues, rock, and jazz greats inspired a band called Black Sabbath. Who went on to write this anti-war epic on their second record, Paranoid. And throughout a bulk of their 70s releases, there was a level of social commentary that went along with their doom and gloom imagery. The horrors of war, the pains of social indoctrination, and environmental collapse were all themes explored in their early releases. And this served as a blueprint of sorts for early rock and proto-metal acts. Coming out of the 70s and into the 80s, Daddy Rob Halford gave heavy metal its own official dress code. He was a closeted gay man who was deeply into BDSM and incorporated that into the band's onstage persona. Which means that if you listen to this shit and dress this way, you are in fact gay. Full stop. Welcome. The anti-war sentiment would continue with songs like this. Kill for gain, or shoot to maim, but we don't need a reason. And this. And we even get a little class consciousness with this.
What do you mean I don't pay my bills? What do you think, I'm broke?
And at this time, namely the Reagan era, the troll-like obsession with horror and occult imagery went hand in hand with raging against Western imperialism, as it presented a tie to the puritanical Christian values of the West that had a strong hold on Western politics at the time. And this occult, satanic-ish imagery led to further stigmatization of heavy metal and punk, as well as growing censorship. You ever wonder where those parental advisory stickers on CDs came from? I mean, you don't listen to CDs, but basically that's where that came from. But with this constant display of mass bravado, performative violence always lingered in the background of the culture, manifesting in different ways. Satanic imagery in metal grew in opposition to a CIA-imposed Catholic regime in Brazil, leading to acts like Sepultura writing songs like this. But the metalheads in Norway were a little bit more antagonistic, drawing upon Nordic mysticism that would then morph into full-fledged fascist sentiment The talk that talk tough guys of metal began to walk that walk by eventually burning down churches. And in Varg Vikernes' case, this arson was accompanied by murder, the release of fascist text, and a racist tabletop game? What the fuck? Now I know this is heavy, but it'll play a bigger part in the story later. Due to the brutality of Varg's actions, he ended up in prison, but these actions garnered him a lot of cultural cachet in the heavy metal scene due to how extreme his anti-Christian sentiment was. And what's noteworthy about this is that Scandinavian countries at the time were living extremely well. They had very high standards of living, and their economies were in pretty good shape. So in order to project that enraged anger and danger found within heavy metal, the violence seemed inevitable. Meanwhile, in the States, heavy music was seemingly on the rise in the pop mainstream. The 90s gave way to more explicitly political music, with the likes of bands like Rage Against the Machine, System of a Down, and to an extent, Tool. And with that, you get what I would call the three variants based on mixtures of those bands' styles. And this decade did still have heavy music that was anti-imperialist, like or and this entire records. Political music continued in the 2000s with a new enemy. Don't wanna be an American idiot. With all eyes on the Bush administration and its atrocities, there was a small resurgence in the protest song, with those across alternative rock, hard rock, metal, all releasing something to that effect at the time. But you'd hardly know it if you listened to Back Off, I'll Take You On, Headstrong. I know. Low-hanging fruit. And at best they had like one hit 20 years ago that for the most part sounds like that one song from that guy who's training outside for an MMA fight and wants you to see how ripped he is. But very similar to the Jarl heavy grunge era. Turn your head now, baby. There was a new grit your teeth type of style of singing. Without love, show me how defenseless you. It was popping off. And with that, there were so many angsty songs about absolutely nothing. And that's what TRAPT does. And they seemingly continue to make headlines based solely off of their hard right heel turn, playing in a post-lockdown hysteria, teaming up with the Proud Boys, as well as tweeting this from their band account.
Oh my God, bro. Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck, man?
This has made them the unofficial laughingstock of the hard rock community. And I find them interesting because they are a good example of how making a far-right shift can totally backfire if you do not have the cultural cachet to back it up. Meaning aligning with fascist groups like the Proud Boys isn't a good idea if you have one hit every 20 years. Also, don't say shit like this. What's important to acknowledge is that the heavy music space is a little unique because, a little bit like hip-hop, it offers a space for its predominantly male fan base to be vulnerable, express pain, sorrow, and confusion while exercising anger through a rugged and edgy persona. But that predominant fan base is also mostly white. And that's important, but I'll get into that later. And of course, there are layers of sincerity to consider. For every Linkin Park, there's a Godsmack, or whatever this is. Just kidding, I really like Mudvayne. But to rein it back in, the satanic imagery was kind of watered down to creepy monster humanoid figure imagery. And from what I can tell, the fuck imperialism, I won't do what you tell me sentiment that the 90s kind of cultivated was watered down as well. And I attribute that to how monolithic whiteness interacts with music in America, meaning how these bands congregated and who their audiences were. The consistent atomization of the suburbs produced kids who felt isolated and angry even though they came from stable households. There was a level of resentment, but instead of focusing it on the structures that destroyed communities, gentrified areas, and destroyed wildlife to build the suburbs, it was more focused on the superficiality of the suburbs and the conformity of the inhabitants. And this is where the hot topicification of rebellious subculture comes from, as well as the apolitical nature and broad songwriting that became very popular at the time, where hard rock artists wrote broad songs rebelling against something, some unnamed force trying to hold them down, without any actual specificity. And this is where Godsmack and Disturbed come into the equation.
far away when I feel the snake bite enter my vein.
Outside of both kind of almost being indistinguishable from each other, their brands are loosely built off of pseudo-rebellious music that is a little bit apolitical. Both artists have gone on the record to state that they feel like artists shouldn't put their political beliefs into their songs, even though their actions directly contradict that statement. And Disturbed has a record from the 2000s, I believe, called 10,000 Fists that was anti-war, from what I remember. But whatever. Sully Erna, Godsmack's frontman, has gone on the record saying that Schmovid-19 isn't a serious killer, as well as weird Joe Biden vaccine conspiracies. And as of a few weeks ago...
Oh my God, bro. Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck, man?
So what's with the contradiction? Are heavy musicians naturally reactionaries? Denying the lethality of a virus that literally unalived so many people and left a lot of Americans and people abroad newly disabled? Or aligning with the state that is currently undergoing genocide so shamelessly, even though the Israeli state has been called out by every human rights organization for its atrocities? Luckily, all that remains frontman and consistent Tim Pool collaborator Phil Labonte can fill us in. He can't, but let's listen to what he has to say anyway. Phil, as a libertarian metalhead, can really offer some perspective into how a lot of these frontmen and musicians think. In a recent interview, he says, "I think that the rebellious nature of music, a lot of times, historically, has come with the fact that the right kind of had cultural dominance in the United States. And I think since probably the mid-90s, that has been changing, or has changed. So now the left having the cultural dominance and also having political dominance, because the left really sets the tone for the US, and the right kind of response." I love that Phil said this, not because he's making an educated critique on how American society operates, but it's a great example of how politically out of touch a lot of these men are. First, Phil conflates neoliberal policy in the United States with leftism. But within our understanding of the political spectrum, the left categorically starts with anti-capitalism, something neoliberals do not acknowledge at all. Neolibs want capitalism and are cool with reforms. That is where a lot of folks kind of get dragged into political conversations without really understanding what they're talking about. But that is, general 101 poli-sci. So let's move on. As we discussed earlier, growing transgression against the controlling structures led to reactionary sentiment infiltrating metal in the 90s. Not just metal, most heavy music, but most in the scene were willing to write off the more extreme and fascistic members of the community as just an extreme fringe and not a core member of the community. At the same time, many of those who were leading or in control of these spaces did nothing to discern their politics as different than the more extreme right. See where I'm going? And with the majority of its fan base being mostly white, and many of these frontmen lacking political literacy, the scene's reactionary tendencies were bound to get worse. But why is race important? It is for many reasons. One thing I'm going to say is this might upset people who are not used to talking about race. But if politics are taboo within discourse and music, something you shouldn't talk about on your platform, which is what they say that they believe, then white men tend to depoliticize issues that affect them personally, meaning that they're willing to speak about them, be passionate about them, if they feel that this thing that affects them personally is unjust. This is true for some marginalized groups and fringe movement leaders, but in regards to heavy metal and hard rock, it's important because white men inform and make up the space. What's acceptable to do, what is acceptable to say, all of it is up to them. And this clues us in on why Phil says that the left has cultural control as well as political control in the US. He doesn't see the battles that BIPOC people or women are fighting as a part of this conversation. And more so, he sees the calls for inclusion and the rallying against misogyny and racism in the heavy music space as active oppression, a capitulation to woke domination that's hindering the freedom and liberty of the white male. In their essay exploring Western nerd and geek culture, postmortem geekdom as simulated ethnicity, Kam Kuyosing, Carter Souls posits, as geekdom moves from the cultural fringes into the mainstream, it becomes increasingly difficult for the figure of the geek to maintain the outsider victim status that made him such a sympathetic figure in the first place. Confronted with his cultural centrality and white masculine privilege, geeks are most frequently represented as white males. The geek seeks a simulated victimhood and even a simulated ethnicity in order to justify his existence as a protagonist in a world where an unmarked straight white male protagonist is increasingly passé. Simulated ethnicity are a term for how geeks read their subcultural identity as a sign of markedness or as a put-upon status equivalent to the markedness of a marginalized identity, such as that of a person of color. And I found this really interesting in that it ties into heavy metal and hard rock conversations like this. R.M Temin uses this term and ties it into the metalhead identity in his essay, How Metal Became So Fucking Reactionary, by stating, the simulated ethnicity manifests among metal fans throughout the genre's history, but especially since it was codified as a transgressive subculture. Metalheads have measured themselves and one another by their dedication to the genre, as signified by various forms of consumption, collections, records, t-shirts, patches, etc. Concert attendance, especially traveling long distances for shows. It's proven to be an effective sorting mechanism to distinguish the true diehards from the neophytes, dilettantes, and posers. On top of that, metalheads will frequently dress and act in a way that declare their dedication to the outside world, thus consciously placing themselves on society's periphery, outside of the monoculture. The metalhead's long hair, leather jacket, and black t-shirts with unreadable logos and grotesque horror imagery become analogous to the thick glasses, comic book merchandise, and social awkwardness of the geek, which in turn is analog to the black and brown skin, femaleness, or queerness of actual oppressed identities in the mind of the geek. This, what I would call a victim mentality or mindset, was exacerbated by the white identitarian politics in the 2010s, leading to the election of Donald Trump and the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And even if these white men, in regards to Phil Labonte, Sully Erna, and David Draymond, aren't as extreme as these tiki torch carriers, they see themselves on the outskirts of a new push culturally. A push that includes black folks, queer folks, and women, meaning that they no longer make the rules. They now have to battle it out with younger folks finding their music, and they really hate that shit. So just like the comedians who said that they were the beacons of truth and the truth tellers, who are now resorting to arguing with their audiences and arguing online with folks who want to hold them accountable for upholding oppressive systems. These dudes view the black, brown, and queer people as the new establishment. Not because they vote Democrat, although to some extent that's a part of it, but these are the only people who expect more of them. Like, maybe don't be bigoted. And even though they've made their money and still sell out shows or play large venues, they still want credit for being a part of the rebellious youth, even though they're part of the protected class. It's how we get metal legends like Tom Araya, who has, at a point in time, put his anti-war and establishment fist in the air on songs like War Ensemble, now photoshopping Donald Trump into his band photos, which in turn will probably lead to them playing a lot less from now on. Or David Draymond, signing bombs for the US-backed Israeli state a year after saying that musicians should keep their politics out of music. It's why cops and bootlickers alike love Rage Against the Machine. And they recently found out that they're a left-leaning band. Like, what the fuck? They see social topics like intersectional feminism, trans rights, and diversity, equity, and inclusion as bigger threats, and in some cases, the establishment culture that must be raged against. But thankfully, these demographics seem to be changing, with established BIPOC artists accepting new ones into the fold, as well as combating bigotry within their own audiences. More importantly, there seems to be a new wave of heavy music that draws upon that anti-imperialist tradition, with affirming songs and powerful music, and by divesting from opportunities that are linked to oppressive regimes and structures, in tandem with highlighting their own unique experiences. So yeah, go to their shows, stream their stuff, buy their merch if you can afford it, and let me know what you think. I want to thank my Patreon members for making all this possible. I'm hoping to make more stuff soon, so if you'd like to join, there's a link in the description, I believe. And if you watched the video this far, you are now gay. I don't make the rules.